Last night, we thought about construing this in terms of educational reform, but really the proper way to set this conversation up is to talk about education.
I'm here more as a father and a husband, than an educator or even a Socratic teacher.
The public education in the United States, I was investigating this because I was wondering why our school systems are so bad at fostering individual vision. The most competitive MBAs in the nation by the Princeton Review. He's extended this work over the last 15 years into the K-12 realm. Jeff and I were talking before this podcast about what we wanted to talk about, and last night we thought about construing this in terms of educational reform, but really the proper way to set this conversation up is to talk about education.
I'm here more as a father and a husband, than an educator or even a Socratic teacher. But I really started life as an entrepreneur. Age 16, I had my first real business. We made $100,000 in profits, which, as old as I am back then, that was real money.
Mm-hmm. What was your first business?
Oil and gas exploration.
At 16?
At 16, we were actually painting tanks out in the hot West Texas sun. So I found I could hire the high school football coaches at our local high school, and instead of paying workers by the hour, I paid them by the job. Mm-hmm. They hired their football players underneath them, and their productivity was 9 times higher.
So why were they more efficient?
Because they were getting paid by the tank, by what they did.
Right, so you had the incentives
lined up. And so they would
properly.
show up at the break of dawn and work till dusk. The people that were being paid in those days $2.15 an hour. If you think about coaches during the summer, they had nothing else to do. What did they have to lose?
They got a chance to work with their team too.
Right, and what do they have to lose, right? They're not doing anything anyway. So it was kind of one of those things where you could put together pieces of a deal to make the pie bigger for everyone.
Right.
And it just worked.
It's exciting to give people an opportunity to experience a direct return on their immediate investment. I mean, one of the things that's nice about hands-on labor, carpentry and contracting and so forth is you immediately see what you produce, and the harder you work, the more there is of it. And so obviously you built those incentives in.
The Socratic method's interesting the way we practice it. There's only 2 questions. Would you do A or B next?
Right.
And then the second question is, what do you mean by A?
Yeah.
It's definitional. So the entire Socratic method is just helping people understand what to do next and why. And when you say what you're going to do, exactly what are you going to do?
Right. So it's the interrogation of a story.
Well, that's the theory. What it really serves as, of course, is a protection of the cartel.
Right.
I mean, it's not really that. But we managed to get it. Wasn't an issue. And we built the program. By then, I've got these 2 children, Charlie and Sam. And they're about to leave from Montessori to get ready to go to elementary school. So I go to see the very best teacher in the very best middle school in Austin that's teaching our daughter, who's older. And I'll never forget this gentleman was an African-American. He looked like Abraham Lincoln, tall, stately, he said, as soon as possible. And I said, well, why? And he said, well, once they've had that kind of freedom, they won't want to be chained to a desk for 8 hours a day and talk to them.
So you get him in chains young.
He looked up and he had tears in his eyes and he shook his head very quietly and he said, I don't either. So I went home that day and I told Laura, I said, I don't know if we're going to homeschool. I don't know if we're going to start a school. But our boys, the best teacher in this town, just told me not to put them in traditional school. So we're going to do something else.
Do you know Paul Gaudy? He pointed out that the public education in the United States, I was investigating this because I was wondering why our school systems are so bad at fostering individual vision.
Yes.
Because it's such a lack. I thought, why? This is such a lack. There's something going on here. Okay. The Prussians established the first public education system. And the reason they did it was because the Prussian emperor wanted to produce obedient soldiers. Disciplined, obedient soldiers. Now, I don't want to get cynical about that, but we got to give the devil his due. And the Prussians actually put forward a very effective military training system. Now, that was adopted in the United States in the late 1800s by industrialists, mostly. They knew that all sorts of rural people were pouring into the cities to start working in factories. their kids needed to be cared for while they worked, and then their kids were likely to have factory jobs. And so the purpose of the public education system, and this is why there's rows of desks and factory bells and this insistence on timing, was to produce disciplined, obedient workers. You have to give the devil his due, but in a somewhat post-industrial world, which is what we're in now, it's not obvious at all that obedient worker / soldier is the right model for human development.
We just wanted something different for our children. So we started out with a blank sheet of paper. This is all about the time Khan Academy and some great new things on the internet are bubbling, with the Socratic method, and said, what would we design for our children? We started out with 7 children.
And where did you get the other kids?
By talking to everybody in town and seeing who would be crazy enough to join us. Now, by that point, the Acton MBA, named after Lord Acton, power tends to corrupt, absolute power corrupts absolutely. The Acton MBA is pretty well known in town, so the fact we start this thing called Acton Academy, it has a little bit of linkage in Austin to be something people might trust us with their children.
Right. So you got a bit of communication clout.
Yes, every child who enters our school is a genius who deserves to find a calling that will change the world. Now, by genius, we don't mean 180 IQ. What we mean is a special talent at something. Because if you're the best plumber in town, you're going to make more money and be happier than the average Ivy League graduate.
Well, there are multiple intelligences, but we can't measure any of them.
Right.
But having said that, again, you have to give the devil his due, is that cognitive ability does seem to have a unidimensional structure. There's one dimension of being smart or not being smart. And the smarter you are, the faster you can learn a complex job.
Well, we're now beginning to have a middle school. And that's where I step in and I end up running the middle school and the high school with 45 students. I do that because we've hired this traditional teacher who's won a lot of awards. And the week before we're going to start, he turns to me and says, when these middle schoolers get out of line, you just jack them up against the lockers and tell them who's boss. And I went back and told Laura, I said, you're going to fire this guy. So you might as well do it now. And she said, well, middle school's going to start in a week. What am I going to tell the parents? And I said, well, I'll step in for a little bit and I'll help. Who volunteers for the audit committee?
Yeah, well,
the tough people, right?
Yeah.
I mean, the easy people don't want to do the work. So now you got the toughest judges. They'll take the 3 people that the studio said should be audited and at random choose 3 more. Now, no one knows whether you were chosen at random or you were on the list. Kind of everybody probably knows, but then we're going to do a deep audit of those badges.
The population prevalence of dark tetrad traits at a clinical level is about 4%. And so the dark tetrad is Machiavellian, narcissistic, psychopathic, and sadistic. And that cross-culturally, that seems to be about 1 person in 25 who's enough like that to be a serious problem. They'll game well-functioning systems to attract credit to themselves with no work. And so you always see, people think that societies can just be set up on a cooperative basis and that you can just assume the best about everyone and that'll work. And it does work 96% of the time, but it really doesn't work 4% of the time. And that 4% is toxic enough to bring the whole damn system crashing down.
This is why, by the way, we don't ever talk about the success of our graduates, because it's their success. We just want to hear us talk about that. I mean, we just don't. It's their success, not ours to claim. And it also brings up the hardest thing we have. It's not the young people, it's the parents. And I asked our son the other day, a good friend was working on something about fatherhood. And I asked our youngest son, Sam, what advice would you give my friend about fatherhood? And he said, when you're younger, you just want your parents around and to pay attention to you.
Yeah.
Not coddle you, but just to be there. And he said, but once you get into kind of middle school, you're really around your peers, and your parents, their job then is to be a good role model.